Hello all, and welcome back if you are returning to these lectures, or for the sake of a more appropriate term, tales of the many creatures, beings, objects, and entities that our agency has been tasked with concealing from the general public. With this being said, today's tale is not of a creature we currently have contained, but is one of our top priorities to secure promptly and without fail. Before I tell you of this entity, however, it is important to give you some context, as the events leading up to this are both quite perplexing, and will give those of you who are newer to the agency an idea of what to expect in this line of work. Before the PDC Agency became an established organisation, many of our founders, agents and soldiers worked for what they believed to be an organisation cut from the same cloth. The name of this organisation may surprise you due to the all too apparent negativity that follows even the subtlest mention of its name: the SCP Foundation. You see, the Foundation had and still has access to sites all across the globe. They owned underground facilities, islands, hidden labs, and on occasion they would take a town or two for their own uses and experimentation. One of the more prominent locations owned by the Foundation was the town of Hawkins, Indiana, although none would have believed anything anomalous could happen there. At least not until the late March of 1986, when the skies turned red, rifts split the town in four, and entities from another world began roaming the streets. Before we get to that though, we have to go back a few more years, to when the Foundation was using Hawkins' laboratory for what would, at first, seem like an unrelated experiment. The Foundation's use of this laboratory was to study the existence of dormant telekinetic and psychic abilities within children. They first found these abilities within the mind of a boy named Henry Creel, a boy who apparently disappeared from the face of the earth but was recorded to have exceptional control over his abilities from a young age. After his disappearance, they continued experimentation with a further 10 subjects, of whom only one was considered a true success. What they were testing for was boundaries in these abilities, so tests would range from being as small as crushing a soda can to the ranged imploding of the minds of escaped D-Class personnel. While we had believed it was the sole objective to study these abilities, later files did reveal a secondary objective. The Foundation was attempting to recreate the existence of these anomalous abilities within newborns, offering expectant mothers large sums of money and the promise of a better life, for the, in quote, small price of taking their child away. Those who accepted the offer were then injected with the blood of Henry Creel, the Foundation hoping that his own cells would awaken the dormant abilities within others. Unfortunately, other than this, we don't have much information regarding the experiments. What we do have are the dregs left behind, or as the Foundation would have us believe, the less important information. Most of the information collected from Hawkins regarding what happened between the experiments and the aforementioned events of March 1986 have been lost, but we suspect they are directly linked in some way. However, after the events of March 1986, it became clear to the Foundation that they would have to take more drastic actions to ensure that what happened in Hawkins stayed in Hawkins. They posed as the military, using the resources at their disposal to enclose the town in electrified fencing and surrounded them with guard towers. They boarded the rifts up with thick cuts of steel and cut off all communications to the outside world. Lorries and vans were allowed in to transport food and living essentials, but the drivers promptly had their memories wiped on exit. Essentially, for 18 months, the people of Hawkins were trapped under the tyrannical heel of a Foundation they didn't even know existed. Our agency has attempted to gather more information, but as with the majority of these events, they are shrouded in mystery and effectively our sources are incomplete. What we have managed to gather is that the eventual downfall of this Foundation site was brought about by none other than a band of civilians who had become disgruntled and angered by the military occupancy. It's also apparent that they had an exceptional understanding of what they apparently called the Upside Down, and the creatures finding their way into Hawkins, an understanding even greater than that of the Foundation operatives stationed there. As far as we can tell, they only wanted to close the rifts, a goal that was ultimately being hindered by the Foundation's efforts to research and secure the realm as one of their own occupancies. Our agency has since pieced together that the Upside Down was actually the space within a wormhole connecting our world to another. It was seen as a pale, grim imitation of the town, with tendril-like growth spreading across near every vehicle, building and tree, and had sickly spores perpetually falling from the sky. The entirety of the realm appeared to be surrounded by a flesh-like wall, that we have also pieced together was a physical manifestation of a bridge connecting the two ends of the wormhole. Once the band of individuals found their way back to our world, they blew up the wormhole, resulting in the collapse and sealing of every single rift opened up in Hawkins. When there was nothing left for them, the Foundation left the site and allowed the civilians to continue living freely, albeit with a few apparent tall tales. We ourselves decided to leave Hawkins in peace, not seeing any possible reason for us to get involved with the town, and we believed that we had as much information as we needed. This was the case until a couple of months ago, when our site started experiencing more attacks by the Foundation, and they had a particularly concerning creature alongside them that is named in files regarding the Hawkins site as the Demogorgon. Following from the attacks, we decided to look into the previously abandoned Foundation site. Now they were using creatures believed to have been neutralized, we needed to make a more conscious effort to research the more vexing entities that they might very well be housing without our knowledge. However, when we approached the town, we were not prepared for what we found, where Hawkins had used to be. In place of a bustling town was silence. Our agents had been briefed to expect nothing but a normal town, but even as they approached, it was clear that wasn't the case. Where the town had been was now surrounded by a 70-foot steel wall, yet strangely there was no visible security. Our agents climbed the wall and, standing at the top, saw what we predict is an imitation of that dark realm. The streets had turned grey, buildings appeared withered, and smoke billowed up to the sky, but more apparent was the lack of human life. From this vantage point, they were shocked to see a monstrous creature with an 8-petaled mouth and a muscular feline form. The creature that has now been labelled in files as the Demogorgon Manticore. We had sent a group of 20 men in. 10 were there to survey the area, and the others were support for any unexpected appearances. In the light of the events unfolding, they decided a larger team was required, and all members rappelled into the walled-off abandoned town. The creature ahead of them had no eyes and no nose, but had a mouth composed of 8 fleshy petal-like forms. Each petal was covered in teeth, and inside was a second jaw filled with 2 rows of razor-like fangs. Its skin was a desaturated brown, and from its head hung countless black tendrils similar to the growths on the buildings, formed into the shape of a lion's mane. On all fours, the beast stood at 7 foot, with 2 hulking front limbs and 2 slightly smaller hind legs. Each limb ended in huge paws and 5-inch long talons. As the agents approached it, guns raised, aimed for the centre of the creature's mouth, it reared up, roaring a bellowing deep roar, which was followed by the reveal that the beast had 2 giant draconic wings. A swarm of what could only be called demobats soon followed, with the creatures coming from every street corner towards the agents. They swarmed them, blocking all view, biting, nipping and clawing over and over, feeding like piranhas drawn to the scent of fresh blood. The team leader, a man by the name of Matthew Duffer, pulled out an electrified baton from his belt and began shocking the creatures, screaming for his men to follow suit. The blue bolts of electricity shocked and sparked through the creatures, knocking them to the ground. In his other hand, he pulled out a pistol, aiming it above him so as to not hit his own men. The bats learned to fear him, but at one point one of the bats swooped in, grabbing the gun from his hand and knocking him on his back. The baton fell from his weakened grip, but he was soon scrambling back to his feet. The shrieks of the demobats pierced his ears, and one of the survivors stated they saw blood rolling from his jawline from the ear canal. He had been calling out for the other men, but nobody could hear what he was saying, and there was no response. From watching the camera footage retrieved from the encounter, we can see he was attacked from behind, and what he failed to notice was the subtly creeping tendrils that had begun wrapping around his ankles. Duffer could be heard on the recording wheezing and panting as he swatted frantically for the creature to leave with his hands, which is when he was yanked towards the floor by the unseen threat. At this point his camera had smashed, but the audio was still being recorded. He fell face first, and was screaming as he was pulled back through the demobats. It was at this moment the Manticore had let out a second roar, scaring the bats away, and all other operatives, although beaten and cut, could visibly see that their team leader was strung up before them. Only half of the men had survived the swarm, but all eyes were fixed on the man being held up before them. Tendrils remained lashed around each of his limbs, slowly tightening and pulling his limbs away from his body. One of his eyes was now missing, his face covered in gashes and wounds. The Manticore had its petaled mouth open wide, saliva seeming to drip in anticipation, as it began to guide a bundle of tendrils that had been tightly wrapped behind its back. From the tangle emerged a feature of the creature that they hadn't previously noticed. They had been formed into a spiral, cocooning what was now prepped to be the final blow. Bringing the tendrils forward, the beast revealed a segmented tail similar to that of a scorpion, with a stinger pointed at the spine of Agent Duffer. It slowly pressed the tip in, as if toying with the operatives watching it, waiting for its prey to scream in agony. Within seconds of the stinger breaking the skin, the pain was too much, and groans turned into a scream that echoed through the surrounding buildings. As a final act, Duffer turned his head, with tears in his eyes and gritted teeth. He called back for the men to take aim. At his word, all agents began firing at the creature. It flinched and roared, but ultimately it was not going down. It plunged its stinger through Agent Duffer before flinging him across the street and into a nearby storefront. It continued forward, still desperate to catch our operatives, but that was not their only problem. Worse still, the sound produced by the gunfire had drawn too much unwanted attention from the creatures they hadn't seen in the shadowed alleyways and boarded up buildings. The humanoid forms of Demogorgon drones began to fill the street, looming, but they themselves appeared afraid to approach the Manticore. They stood there, waiting. In that very moment, we called through the comms for them to fall back, as there had already been far too many casualties. The agents ran, looking back as they did, but the Manticore didn't follow. Instead, the beast flew straight up, disappearing into the smog above the desolate town. With the Manticore gone, there was now 6 Demogorgons stalking them. By the time they reached the wall, only 3 of the agents remained standing. They called in with whatever information they could give on the new entity, and we promptly began compiling a file on this new Demogorgon Manticore. However, with all the information we gathered, the most concerning thing is this. Going off the previously collected files, the Manticore was not an entity that existed or made its way through the rifts. It was not seen in Hawkins at all those years ago. So where did it come from, and are there more entities in this location that we are not aware of? We are considering sending in another group of operatives in order to further explore what we will tentatively call the Demo Capital. We need to gain as much information as possible regarding the creatures within the walls, and now we have more of a tentative understanding, we can be better prepared. What we desperately need to establish is if the creatures inside are naturally occurring to this other world, or if they are being bioengineered from DNA splicing by the Foundation. I will say, although Matthew's brother, Ross, has offered to lead the expedition into the capital, we will not be allowing him access to the site, as he is far too close to the events that occurred. With that, I conclude this lecture. If there are any questions or other entities you would like to learn of, please leave your suggestions in the suggestion box below.